So it's the presentation of the Lord today, but to whom? Well, ostensibly and obviously to his Father. It's the presentation in the temple, fulfilling, the law of Moses. The woman was supposed to go to the temple after 40 days, consecrating a firstborn son in this case, in this way, as we hear. So every child is consecrated to the Lord, of course in baptism according to us, but everyone who's born is consecrated to the Lord. They come from God, they're going to God. So we're all presented to the Lord, not just the firstborn, of the only begotten, so to speak. But offering himself, Jesus, to the Father, to become, as we just heard from the revelation of Simeon, a light to the nations and glory for his own people. But that's not the only presentation. Really, we can say that the Lord's being presented to us. He came into the world to be the light, but he took on, as the opening prayer says, the substance of our flesh, which is a big deal. For God to take that on might give us the courage to take it on ourselves, since we're so afraid of it, the fear of death and all of that the second reading speaks of. But the second reading also gives us the dimensions of what that means for the Lord to present himself with us, as us, in our own flesh, presenting himself to us. It's said that it was to free us from the fear of death. If God himself brings God's life into our flesh, well, then God's life is in our flesh, and that's you can't lose that. Can't go back on it. So we can have faith that God's life is in our flesh. But precisely our flesh, the word became flesh, and as Elizabeth Johnston and other theologians have been pointing out, that flesh means the fragility, the mortality of our flesh. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. It said that he took it on as our brother. He has a full share in our flesh and blood, it says in that second reading, so that he could be a faithful and compassionate high priest. How could he be a compassionate high priest? Unless he tasted the flesh, unless he knew what it was like. And that goes on to affirm that again at the end of the reading, where it says, because he himself has suffered and was tempted, was tried. The word actually means more than just temptation. It means the trials of living in the flesh, the daily burden, all the weakness and the trials that go with life in the flesh. Because he suffered and took that on, he is able to sympathize. And the word is actually there. He took it on. That's literally what it says in Greek. He took it on. He took it on himself, and he's therefore able to help those who are tempted and tried. He knows what it's like. He presents himself to us as one of us, so that we shouldn't be afraid to be who we are. To take on ourselves, take it on, our own flesh and blood, and all its trials and all the connections with one another that it involves and with the earth. And then to be able to to be as Christ was in the world. And that's the next step. So Christ meets us. He meets his Father in the temple, so that he only does and acts as the Father wills in the world, as a reflection of God's own life and love. As he says in John's Gospel, the words I speak are not my own, but the Father's. And the Son cannot do anything of himself, but only what he sees the Father doing. So there's this complete openness. Jesus is always present to the Father, in his divinity, of course, but in his humanity as well. Always present to the Father. The same letter to the Hebrews puts the Psalm 40 on the lips of Jesus. Behold, I come to do your will, O God. You didn't wish sacrifices and burnt offerings, but a body you've given me, or in the Hebrew, you've dug out ears for me to listen, to obey. And in the 5th chapter of this letter, it says he was crying out, in his agony, to the Father with loud cries and tears, and he was heard because of his obedience. It comes from a word meaning to hear, to listen. So Jesus was always listening to the Father. It's a reflection of his relation to the Father and the Trinity. But in his humanity, he was always listening, always presented to the Lord, always present to the Lord, to his Father, to receive that light, to receive that message, to proclaim the good news to the poor, as he was commissioned to do by the Father, to heal, to sympathize with our flesh and blood, and to bring healing and hope to those who are bound by the fear of death and are prisoners their whole life long. But if he does it, so should we. We are called to be as Christ in the world. We are called to be Christ in the world. Christ is himself through us. So we must similarly present ourselves to him and thereby to one another. But that means letting, again, to quote the opening prayer, that we may be presented with pure minds. All right, that's a kind of an awkward phrase, pure minds. What it means was purity of heart, really, to have the ability to be completely presented present to him and to the Father, so that we can say, as Christ does, my words are not my own, but the Father's who sent me. I can do nothing of myself, but only what I see Jesus doing. And that requires that we listen, that we hear, that we be open to what he says to us. But that means the ceaseless, nonsensical, counterproductive mental chatter that's always going on. Even when we're talking to God, God, give me this, give me that. Hold it. God's not meant to listen to you. You're meant to listen to God and find your happiness and salvation in that. Everything else will be given to you besides. Seek first the kingdom and its justice, the whole idea. So we need to learn to present ourselves, to be present to Jesus, to listen, to be quiet, to be able to receive his inspirations, his spirit, his life, his love, to be able to radiate that out to the world. We need to present ourselves to him, to be present to him. We Catholics make a big deal of the real presence in the Eucharist, always talking about the real presence and adoration of the sacrament. That's fine, but it's supposed to lead you to be present yourself. What good is the real presence if we're not really present? No good at all. We have to be equally present so that his presence can invade us and take over us and fill our hearts with his life and love, so that, in the words of Simeon, the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. Indeed, indeed. Maybe that's what we're afraid of. We don't want him to see those thoughts. But he's there to purge all that, to transform all that energy into something which is life-giving for ourselves and others. So we can be filled with his light, with his life, with his love, with his hope, with his compassion for those who are flesh and blood with us and with him. We have to be present. He's destined for the rise and fall of many. Because we have to die. We're afraid of death, as we've heard, but if we die in that way, die to ourselves, to our nonsense, to our obsessions and compulsions, and to all that nonsense, if we die to all of that, then we are alive in Christ. We share the divine life already, which we can never lose. And we find our happiness and our purpose in spreading God's light, Christ's light, and joy and peace and healing and hope to the world. So when that first reading says, here he comes to the temple, he'll be there like a refining fire. He'll purge us and purify us like gold and silver, that first reading says. That's what we're called to be purified, to be illuminated, to irradiate God's light and love. The refiner's fire. The word for refining there, Sarif in Hebrew, seraph, we get the word seraphim from that. The burning angels, the highest angels that are burning with God's love. So we're called to be set on fire like the seraphim. We're called to have our whole being consumed and burned up with a living flame of love and the Spirit, That's what we're called to be, to present ourselves for that transformation so that we can be agents of transformation in the world with God's love, the fire of God's love, and joy and peace and healing. So let's learn to present ourselves moment by moment, live in the presence of God, to be present moment by moment to the Lord, to have the ears of our heart, alert, open, eager to receive the inspirations of the Spirit for what we do and what we say. Let's be present to the one who is constantly and eternally present to us, not just in the tabernacle, constantly, all day long, present to us. If we can be present to him, we'll find our happiness there. We'll find our identity there. We'll find our mission there. We'll find our joy there. And so will everybody else.